Hi people! So, in a video I made a few days ago, I talked about the secondary stats for Discipline Priests. And I made some comparisons, and I did some math, and what I found was that, first of all, Mastery is the best stat by a mile, or secondary stat, and second of all, the other stats don't even come close. That is something that goes like in direct opposite direction of basically every Discipline Priest healing guide that I've looked at, and that I found to be very strange and kind of weird. So I asked people to maybe comment what they thought the reason could be, maybe if they figured that I'd done some assumptions wrong, or if the math would be wrong, or whatever. And I got some comments that were, well, giving me some feedback on that. Some of the feedback points I feel were like basically a misunderstanding of what I said, or maybe a misunderstanding of how something works. But I didn't really feel like commenting it and being like, actually, when you said that, it's really this and blah blah blah. That would just be annoying, and I'd be nagging and whatever. It's not that important. But some of the points were also pretty solid. And the biggest points that I realized could be the cause for why my findings were so different to what all the guides had. Well, there were basically 3 points. The first one is pretty obvious, and that is that Atonement isn't the only healing that you're doing. It's certainly a really big portion of all the healing. Sometimes it might be the biggest portion, but it's certainly not the only one. And the second one was that Atonement only helps, or Mastery only helps, if Atonement is active. So, although I have really high Mastery, it does nothing for my Shadowland unless Atonement is active. You could see that was 5k, and now we had, well, that was a crit. And there we have 7.8k. So that's a big increase. But obviously, if Atonement isn't active and I only do a Shadowland, then Mastery is worthless. And in that situation, every other secondary stat would have still helped me. So I realized that what I really needed to do to get a good understanding or get a good comparison for the secondary stats was, first of all, I need to get a distribution, or like a representative distribution of the healing spells. Second of all, I need to know how many of the spells that hits a target that has Atonement active, because that is a pretty major healing increase. Now, both of those things turned out to be doable via Warcraft logs. I went over to the Discipline Priest Discord, and I partly asked for someone who had the math behind the secondary stat values, to which I got the reply that some dude had a Excel sheet that was way too messy and not ready to be shared. But I also got help with determining whether a spell was hitting a target that had Atonement active. And what I got was this query that I'm gonna post in the comment section below, that you go to queries, and then you just type it in here, and then you create the pin. Now, I've already done it a number of times. It doesn't do anything extra if you do it 3 or 4 or 2 times, whatever. And what this does is it checks whether the target has this buff ID active on itself. And if we copy paste it, search for it, you can see that it checks whether they have Atonement active. So, now we have all the healing done for 2.5 dungeons basically. This is Necrotic Wake on 10 or 11. This is Mists of Turn Scythe, and this is the other side. And yeah, like I said, it's the entire dungeon. They are on plus 10 or 11. That one is like a third of the dungeon. We have the distribution, like how much healing was done by Atonement, Shadowman, whatever. And then now, thanks to this query, we know how many of them actually hit a target that had Atonement active. So what we do now is we basically write all these numbers over to Excel. I will quickly comment that the healing done by Leech, Desperate Prayer, Church of the Grave, and that, I will not include these in the calculations, and they make up less than 2% of all healing done. And the logic is basically that if these spells turns out to be the tipping point to whether one secondary stat is better than the other, then indeed the secondary stats are very close to each other, and there's no point in going for one instead of the other. So it's like, this essentially won't affect what I found what I find because it's such a small portion of the healing. So we copy things over to the same Excel document. We have all the spells down to the second effect of Mind Games. We have the total hits, that's what we're using here, of every spell. I'll quickly say, for example, that for shields, they're gonna use the hit to each target that is shielded and not the total value of the shield. And that makes sense because obviously if the healing isn't, let's say, if the absorb isn't used, so to say, then the shield is useless. So cast isn't that important. What's really important is the number of hits that targets with shields receive. So we have the number of total hits, we have the number of hits without atonement, and number of hits on atonement targets. And there we have the percentage of the hits on targets with atonement. And obviously you cannot heal a target through atonement unless atonement is active. So that's obviously 100%. Shadowlands, well, sometimes you're using it on a DPS that you haven't healed in a while, so it won't have atonement. So that's why it's not at 100%. The shield is really high, and I think that there are two big reasons. The first one is that if your target is taking damage, I never use the shield, because if they have taken damage, I want to heal them. And maybe after that I'll put a shield on them, and in that case they're gonna have atonements. And also I'm basically only using the shield to keep atonement active on the tank when the tank is at full health and atonement is about to wear off. Because at my level of mastery, which is 36%, it's a big difference in the strength of the shield whether you have atonement active or not. You can see that's 2.6k and that's 3.5, so that's almost 1 more k from the shield by just making sure to time it. So I feel like that's a big deal. That's why I try and time the shields. And then also, if I were to use Rapture, I try to first Radiance to make sure that all the targets have atonements, because if you compare the strength of a shield without atonements, you can see that's 7k, and with atonements, that's 10k. So that's obviously a big deal. Let's see if we can get a crit. No, we can't. Anyway, that's why shielding is really high. Radiance is quite low for, well, because I often use Radiance to apply atonement, and therefore it will naturally be low. Penance is pretty high, because if I use it to heal, I will usually do like a Shadowland and then a Penance. Otherwise, I'll just use it to DPS. And obviously, Pen Mastery does not affect the reverse shield from Mind Blast or the ones from Mind Games. We also have the average heals, and this is the total average heal, not just the atonement heals. We have the total healing done, and the total healing and percentage of everything. So you can see, for example, atonement did almost 30% of all healing. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at how much would our total healing increase if we gained 100 in each particular secondary stat. So what we'll do is I'll look at all the healing done by atonement, and obviously atonement only heals targets with atonement active. So I'll take 100 divided by 25.9, and then I get it in percentage. I'll multiply that by the total healing done, and then I'll divide it by the total healing done by atonement, and then I'll divide it by the total healing done. And then we'll see how much the increase from atonement healing would be with this mastery compared to the total healing done. And we would get 1.14% more total healing done from atonement if we had got another 100 mastery. As for Shadowman, Shield, Radiance, and Penance, I am considering or taking into account that not all of the heals were on targets with atonement. Therefore, I'm only multiplying with the heals that actually hit their target with atonement. And adding all of these things together, we see that 100 mastery would increase our total healing output by 2.87% healing. We do the same for crits, and in case you didn't know, shields can crit. I'll see if I'll be able to show you that. We'll just consider 1% crit the same as 1% more HPS, because you'll crit with 1% more of the spells, and 1 crit is twice the normal damage, so average at over 100 spells with 1 extra crit, that will be the corresponding 101 heals. Whatever, it's just the way that it works out. 100 heals, 1 crit. The crit is double or twice the healing, meaning you'll get the healing equal to 101 heals, while casting 100 heals, meaning it's gonna be a 1% healing increase. I hope that that makes sense. And that's when you average it out. And you can see, for example, on spells with a low atonement uptime, like Radiance, crit pulls ahead. It's very even for Shadowland. And then we see that we get 2.57% extra healing from crits. Versatility, the same thing. As you know, 40 versatility is just 1% DPS and 1% healing. So 2.25. Haste is kinda tricky, because if we consider the atonement healing, if we assume that we get a 1%, like, let's look at the damage dealt. 1% haste will of course be 1% DPS for smite, because you get more casts, for Purge the Wicked, because it ticks faster. But for penance, the thing is that penance has a 9-second cooldown, and the cooldown is not affected by the haste. And when you really consider the damage output by penance, you need to look at the whole cycle and not just the cast time. Because if it didn't have a cooldown, we would spam penance all the time, like we did with smites. But there is a cooldown, and it's quite long compared to the casting time, and haste does not affect it. So even if we were to get 100 haste, that would only reduce the cycle length by 1 second, meaning that 100 haste would basically only be 10% DPS. So for any damaging spell with a cooldown, haste is pretty weak, like it is for penance and mind games. For Mindbender and Mindblast, either the attack rates for Mindbender is increased and the cooldown is decreased for Mindblast, therefore we can still use the 1% haste as 1% DPS. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at how many of these spells you could actually cast more of if you had more haste, which will be Smite, Purge the Wicked, Mindbender, and Mindblast. And that adds up to about 70% of all the DPS done, or I think 69.70%, but close enough to be viewed as 70. So when we look at the atonement healing increase, we're gonna do like we did before, except we'll multiply it by 0.7 to take into account that it's not a 1% DPS increase to get 1% haste. Or in this case, I think it's 33.2, yeah. That's the way it should be. There we go. I hope that I did that right for all of them. I'll have to just edit that as I look at them. Regardless, you can see it's 0.62% more healing from atonement healing when you get 100 haste. It's 0.76% from shadow mending when you're just spamming it. Shield, Radiance, and Penance. All of these have the same issues, which is the cooldown is not affected by haste. However, the cast time is. So, what I'll do is I'll assume that all the time that you save, either because of a shorter global cooldown or because of a faster cast time, all that time will be used to use Shadow Mend. So, for example, we did, I think, 300 shields, yes, and I'll assume, I think that I have a 1 second global cooldown now, or it might actually be a bit longer, but we'll assume 1%. And then we get about a 3% haste increase, so we'll basically multiply the amount of the time that the global cooldowns took by 0.03, and then that time that we gain will be used to cast Shadow Mend. And as you can see, we get about 0.48% from those Shadow Mends when looking at the shields. We get 0.16% from the Radiances and the 0.17% from Penance. And also Mind Blast is affected by haste, so 0.18%. All of this adding up to 2.4% or 85% of the mastery efficiency. And so these numbers are based more on practice than the other ones. As you can see, mastery pulls ahead, second comes crits, then haste, and lastly versatility. Now, it's not a super big difference, and if you're a bit sloppy on your atonement uptime, then obviously mastery won't be the best. But supposing you pay some attention and try and play clever, mastery will be the best. I've talked a bit about how the DPS would be affected in the first video, so I won't really talk too much about it here, but if you feel like DPS is worth like 25% of the healing, which I think is a very bad assumption to make, because as a healer your primary job is to keep people alive and not to deal DPS, even as a discipline priest. And like I showed in the first video, despite the fact that mastery itself doesn't affect your DPS, it's still the best to increase your atonement healing. But yeah, they're way closer now than they were before, so it's very possible that, for example, if you didn't pay as much attention to atonement, like for example, what I usually try and do is when I'm fighting the prideful ghosts, I'll wait until everyone is at 80%, then I'll do the first radiance, keep DPSing, and 2 seconds before atonement runs out, I'll do the second, because that will make sure the direct healing from radiance will always hit targets with atonement, which is a big healing increase. If you, for example, go sloppy with that and almost never do it, and you know, you don't try and radiance before shields or whatever, I could see maybe crits and haste pulling ahead of mastery. But at least at this level of play, at this level of keys, mastery pulls ahead. Now I'll also mention quickly that all of haste, crit, and versatility increases your mana efficiency, meanwhile haste does not. It's almost the opposite, because haste, crit, versatility means you'll do bigger heals, but you'll do them slower, but the mana cost remains the same. Meanwhile, haste gives you weaker heals that you cast faster for the same price. So if you compare, let's say, 25% haste with 25% mastery, supposing you'll have 0 in the other, then you'll need to do 25% more heals with a 25% haste compared to 25% mastery, meaning to heal the same amount of damage, you will have to pay 25% more mana, which is obviously not good at all. Although your Mindbender attack speed or Powered Solace is, like the cooldown is either decreased or the attack speed is increased. For example, if we look at Solace, it has a 15 seconds base cooldown, meaning 4 hits per minute, meaning 4%. 1% out of 50,000, that's 500, multiply that by 4, you get 2k extra mana per minute, which means, I think, 166 MP5, so at 100% haste, you'll have another 166 MP5, which you can just compare to this 2k here and realize that even though this cooldown is reduced or this attack speed is increased, the mana efficiency still falls far behind for haste, which I think also matters quite a lot, and like I think that that's another reason to not just stack haste, or actually I think that's a reason to stack mastery. But I guess the final thing that we could say is that often the damage is somewhat spiky. Like on intense fights, you'll spam a lot of targets, meaning they'll basically always have atonement up. Meanwhile, on less intensive fights, you more often heal targets without atonement, meaning that on intense fights, that's where mastery really pulls ahead, and it's because of those fights that it, in the end, at least for me, is the strongest stat. And I guess that you really want the healing when you really need it. I mean, if you're doing fine on the healing, then, I mean, obviously you don't have to care about it, but I don't think that there's any value in doing slightly better when you're already doing fine, and then struggling when you really need to do the healing, which is what I feel like, it's not entirely like that, but that's kind of what you're getting with crit and haste, because mastery will benefit you way more in a situation that's more intense than crits, haste, or versatility would do. But anyway, this is probably the last thing or the last video that I'll do on the secondary stats for a discipline priest. I still stand by the conclusion that mastery is your best stat. Although at this point, with everything we consider, it's now not just super obvious. You kinda have to consider that in your playstyle to keep atonement up. And I think that regardless of which secondary stat you use, you should try and focus that, because even at 0% mastery, or sorry, 0 mastery, you still have 11%, so that could really be the difference between wiping or making it on a fight, those 10% of HPS. Anyway, that was all from me for now. I still have a few videos that I want to make about Discipline Priest, but like I said, I'm not going to talk much more about secondary stats. Also, of course, go for item, or at least intellect before them. I would probably make the trade, like if I had a pair of versatility crit boots, let's say, I would absolutely switch them to something with mastery. And for example, if I could get... Well, these boots I might keep, but actually I think that... Let's say that I could switch this to a 200 item level belt that had like 57 mastery and 37 crit. I would absolutely do that if I could. So like small differences, if you get a lot of mastery, I think that that's worth it. It comes down a bit to your preferred playstyle, but intellect is still really your best stat for your healing overall, because it basically does what mastery does, except you don't have to have atonement active for it to work. So I'll say thanks everyone for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. I'll be back soon with another video, and until then, see ya!